Hello and welcome once again to Chats with Atheists. My name is Father Antonius and I serve in Sydney, Australia. We have been over the past 3 years conducting an apologetics discussion group where we've been discussing interesting topics such as, has Christianity been good for the world? And today we're going to be looking at this topic. Has Christianity in history been something beneficial for civilization, or has it actually been bad for civilization? We think of the Crusades, we think of the Spanish Inquisition. Would the world have been better over the past 2,000 years without Christianity? That's the topic we'll be talking about today, together with, once again, we welcome Peter Bowditch, a long-time activist in the humanist and sceptical movement in Australia. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you with us. The aim of these discussions, Peter, has been to have a rational and sensible discussion about issues relating to faith and scepticism, and basically to try and come to the truth, to understand what reality is really like. And that's something we were just talking a little bit earlier. That's something that I think we both share, isn't it?
I think it is. The basis of scepticism, and coming from the philosophical position of scepticism, is a search for the truth. Religion is, in a sense, the same type of thing. It is a search for an explanation of why things are the way they are, where we came from, where we're likely to go in the future. So these things are related. We just might have different views about what's behind it all.
Yes, and come to different conclusions.
But I think that there's definitely there's common ground there without having to have a war about this.
Well, let's see how much common ground there is on this topic. So, the allegation has been made that the world would have been better off without Christianity. So we mentioned the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades. There have been religious wars between Christians of different types, not to mention Christians against people of other religions. Some people would say apartheid was given a religious foundation. Then there's the the Dark Ages, where the church supposedly squashed any people who were trying to find enlightenment and truth. Some people say that the church resisted the Enlightenment itself when it happened. Do you have a point of view on this?
I think, for most of the last 2,000 years, religion or the church has been civilization, certainly in Europe anyway. It's different in other parts of the world, but then if you go to lots of places in Asia, they have religious traditions going back just as far, and which in a lot of cases also drove the society. Japan was essentially a religious society for many years, with the emperor as the living god, and that only stopped by official declaration after the Second World War, when part of the agreement of the surrender was that the emperor was no longer the emperor and no longer god. Certainly, I think that you can't separate the European civilization over the last 2,000 years from the church. Some parts of it were obviously good, some parts were obviously bad. The Catholic Church obviously was the church, provided the essential organisation of society for much of that time. It provided the hierarchy, the politics, if you like, the government of lots of those countries. So you can't deny the influence of it. Yes, there were good and bad things. For good and evil, yes. There were good and bad things done. Yep. Many of those things were done for good intentions, even though they might have been very bad things. The Crusades, when we look back on them, seem to be quite bizarre religious wars. But the people who were doing that truly believed that salvation lay in freeing the Holy Land back to the true religion.
Well, I think the argument could be made that a lot of those things that we've listed weren't really done because they were taught by Christianity, but almost done in spite of what Christianity teaches. I mean, one would find it hard to imagine Christ himself leading a crusade and going out to kill people and fight in battles and so on. One could hardly imagine Christ himself, who was tried by Pontius Pilate and put to death, then turning around and trying other people and putting them to death, as the Spanish Inquisition did.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting that if you get some of the sort of apocalyptic people, you find this basically mainly in the United States, where you get people who believe that the only book in the entire Bible that means anything is Revelation, and therefore Jesus will carry a sword and kill people and carry on.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to me to be about what really Christianity is about.
No.
Yes, these things were aberrations, if you like. The Crusades were also, too, I think, in a sense, political things. That is that if you raised an army, you could raise lots of taxes to pay for the army as well. So
Yes, they did solve a lot of other problems apart from the Jerusalem problem, didn't they?
that's right.
Both for the Pope at the time and the secular rulers.
Yeah. The Inquisition was a different issue, I think, where that seemed to be a case of people applying rules too ferociously. Modern day equivalent would be the Taliban in Afghanistan,
Yes.
where you take a set of religious texts and apply them in some kind of fashion which to an outsider looks to be really strange and bizarre.
Yes, and often to insiders. I think there's a lot of Muslims who see what the Taliban is doing as an aberration as well.
Oh, I'm sure there are. The Inquisition, it's interesting, the Inquisition is what refers to as the Spanish Inquisition. That was where it had its most effect. And that was where most of the putting to death of people and heretics and so forth went on. But remember too that there were other parts of Europe where people were put down because they had beliefs. At one stage it was very, very dangerous to argue about the Trinity, and it maybe still is in some places, where you could be put to death for denying it or agreeing with it or whatever, depending on who was in power at the time. These are political issues, and I think were related to the fact that the church had this position of power in society, which it no longer has.
Yeah.
So, yes, there were bad things done. Whether you can say that, look back and say, well, gee, we're going to reject all of Christianity because dreadful things happened in the Crusades, is probably a simplistic view.
Yes, pretty much akin to saying, well, because Hitler was basically, an atheist, he had some kind of spirituality, but he certainly didn't believe in the Christian God, and therefore all atheists must be horrible.
Yeah, so when I've had that one used on me many times, and say, well, really, I don't see Hitler didn't do what he did because he was an atheist.
Yeah.
He didn't say, I'm going to fight here to actually establish an atheist society.
No.
He might have, in fact, he didn't. He actually pretended to be a Catholic.
Yes.
He may really have been one. And at the time, again, that's another thing too, that the involvement of the Catholic Church in the Second World War and afterwards, in their involvement with the Nazi Party, particularly in Germany, in some cases was absolutely disgraceful. Then there were Catholic priests that ended up in concentration camps.
That's right, yes, and who strongly disapproved of what was going on. Probably, and we would say because of their Christian morality and their view of right and wrong.
Some people like Bonhoeffer and that was definitely, they were driven by their interpretation of what Christianity should be.
Let's do a little thought experiment, Peter. Let's imagine for a moment that Christ never came to the earth, never walked upon the earth, and therefore that the Christian church never eventuated. What would the world be like today?
I'm not sure it would be too terribly different. There were already established religions at the time. We might all be observing Yom Kippur rather than Christmas, but I think something would have come along to replace it. Europe at the time was a set of basically feuding little states.
Yes.
One thing the church did was unite them, or not so much unite them, but give them some kind of common cause. I think if Christianity hadn't come along, if Christ hadn't come, there would have been something in its place. Islam grew up, 600 years later, and became a dominant religion in that same part of the world where Christianity came from. So there would have been a vacuum to fill. I think if there hadn't been Christianity, there would have been something else.
Well, as you say, there were pre-existing religions, what we'd call pagan religions, I suppose. And I think, obviously, the reason I bring it up, I think, is it's a good way to think about the effect that Christianity had on the world. Having looked a little bit into the pagan religions, they had a very different worldview to the one that we hold today. In that, for example, the idea of the equality of all human beings was a very foreign idea to the pagans, who had a very structured sort of idea of the universe, who had the idea that slaves and I get in trouble whenever I mention this, but women as well were almost subhuman, or certainly not at the same level of importance. So, although it's interesting that today the Christian church is often accused of being backward and not giving women equal rights and that sort of thing. I understand from the historians that the whole idea of the equality of male and female was kind of a revolution that Christianity brought about, and it's something that not a lot of people really think about today.
Well, part of the problem with that was the things that St Paul said about women's position in society.
Yeah.
And I suppose realistically, Paul was the inventor of Christianity in terms of what he did, preaching it, spreading it and so forth at the time. These criticisms can also be addressed to the Christian church.
Yeah.
And the fact that not just the Christian church but many other religions as well, that Christianity condones slavery because people were able to find verses in the Bible that said this is what you can do, this is what slaves are for. You can take any complex religious text or any complex book and make it mean anything you like if you really want to.
Well, that's true, yeah. I mean, the other argument would be, though, that slavery was eventually abolished in the West by Christian conviction.
Yes.
All the people who really agitated against it and brought about the change were actually motivated by their Christian ideals. And it was St. Paul also who said that in Christ there is no longer male nor female.
Yeah.
So you're quite right. It depends on how you're going to read the text and interpret it. Yeah.
One of the things I think that where Christianity differs from other religions, it is because it allows this dissent and dispute and discussion about things and interpretation. Someone was saying just recently that there are more Christian sects in the world than there are verses in the Bible, which suggests that there's an enormous amount of interpretation available and allowable there to go on. Yeah. Yes, the people like Wilberforce and that oppose slavery based it on their understanding of Jesus' teaching and what they read in the Bible. Other people were taking a different view about it. Yeah. But I think that Christianity allows that form of dissent, that form of argument, that many other religions don't do.
Yeah. And I think from the Orthodox point of view, which obviously I'm most interested in, there's this lovely theology about the human being the image of God and our purpose being to strive to return to that image of God. And I think when you hold that kind of theology, then you see every human being as the image of God in a way, and therefore deserving of respect and value no matter who they are.
Yeah. Well, this is the humanist position as well, so you don't really need religion to do that, which says that human beings have an intrinsic worth of their own. Yeah. And we should look at that value, treat people equally.
Now, I'm interested to know, I mean, from the Orthodox Christian point of view, we base the value of the human being on the image of God. As a humanist, you don't have that available to you, so how does the humanist come to that point of view of the value of the human being?
I think it's basically saying that humans have an intrinsic value themselves. Yeah. That is that we are all the same kind of people, that we should all be treated the same way.
Okay.
So we don't really need to have a God that says this is the model for it. That we're here with what we've got, and what we've got are people that can think, people that can feel, people with emotions, people that can love each other or hate each other. And we have to work with that and with what we've got.
Would it be true to say that because being a human being myself, I experience, life and emotions and abilities to know and to do things, and that I know that my life has value, and I therefore, transfer that value also to other people? Or
I think that's right. We know as an individual what we are. Yeah. And it goes back to the golden rule, which is in all religions and all societies forever.
And in non-religion as well, apparently. to do unto others what you would have them do to you.
That we should have respect for other human beings, not just human beings. I mean, it's not just humanists who also say that we should be kind to animals, for example. Yeah. That this is should be a universal agreement. Yeah. So humanism basically says that we don't need a model. We are here. Our model is ourselves, how we would like to be treated.
Sure. And again, from the Orthodox perspective, there's this lovely theology of how man is at the pinnacle of the creation and therefore responsible for the animals and for the world. And that actually means that the true Christian kind of has to be a greenie, has to care about the environment and so on, because that's our responsibility to preserve that.
It's interesting that a few years back in the United States, again, back to the sort of Southern Baptist crazies, if you like.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying terrible things about all Southern Baptists. I'm sure they're not all mad.
Yes, I don't think they watch this show, so...
No, that's good, right? Well, if they do, they can write in and complain. That at one stage there was a secretary of the forestry, or the minister responsible for the forestry in the United States, declared that there was no need for conservation policies because the end of the world was coming very shortly, based on Christ's prophecy. So you didn't really need to preserve the forests and the environment, which seemed to be sort of a crazy thing. It was,
Yes.
when Jesus actually told people to, you have a responsibility for this stuff, to look after the environment, look after the world around you.
Yes.
You should try to leave it a better place than you found it. It just seemed odd for someone to say, this was back in, this would have been when 2000 was coming up and the end of the world was going to happen, that the man responsible for the forests of the United States basically came out and said, we don't have to preserve these forests.
Yes, that's a bit of a worry.
It is. Well, actually interesting that 2000 did bring out a lot of that sort of very strange thinking of people.
Yes.
It was the sort of people who say that they want a war in the Middle East. They want Israel to actually invade Gaza and vice versa, because that will hasten the coming of Armageddon.
Yes.
I'm not quite sure whether even most Christians actually want it to happen really quickly.
Well, no. I think, again, in sort of Eastern Christianity, we value the world, and we are actually supposed to be building the kingdom of God here little by little. So we're supposed to be bringing peace, we're supposed to be bringing love and charity and kindness and those sort of things. To hope for a war is really the opposite of what we understand Christianity to be about.
Oh, but some of the things that were coming out at the time were actually quite... these people were claiming to be Christians.
Yes.
But seemed, like I said, seemed to be the only book in the Bible they'd ever read was Revelation.
Yes.
And then they'd misinterpreted it anyway.
Yeah.
But it's actually a fascinating read. It's sort of stuff that back in the 1960s and 70s people would have read and said, gee, Timothy Leary wrote this. That it was, it's a fascinating piece of literature.
It is.
But to actually look at that and say, this is a precise prediction of what the world's going to be like in 2000, which is an arbitrary date anyway, it just seemed to be odd. But there's sort of, there was that movement towards it. People are saying, yes, we want to see a nuclear war in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Because in Revelation it predicts that there will be wars.
Yes, well, I suppose people have been using the Bible to predict the end of the world for 2,000 years.
Oh, that's right.
Nobody's got it right yet.
It's very easy to do it.
Yes.
I actually remember at the time commenting to somebody who was claiming to be a Christian how they reconciled knowing that the world was going to end at the end of 1999 with Jesus' statement saying nobody's going to know when I'm coming back.
Yes.
And of course they had some trite answer about how that bit doesn't matter and so forth.
Yeah.
I'll believe this bit, not that bit.
Yeah.
I would think if you're going to be a Christian, the words you look at is what Jesus said,
Exactly.
not what somebody else said later or what somebody else said that he said.
Absolutely. Well, going from the very inaccurate science of interpreting Revelation to the more accurate science of science, again, the allegation has been made against Christianity that through the Dark Ages and the Enlightenment, the Church was anti-education, anti-knowledge, anti-science when science came along. And the allegation has been made that if Christianity hadn't existed in the world, we would be more advanced today than we are. Do you think there's much truth to that?
There was certainly a lot of restriction. For example, the fact that people couldn't read the Bible.
Yes.
This was one of the objections that Luther made, that the Bible at the time was in Latin or Hebrew, that it was restricted, you couldn't own one yourself. It could only be read in a church. It could only be read by a priest to the population or to the congregation. And that was one of the objections. So we had an illiterate society. The transformation that happened over that period from Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door up till the release of the King James Bible in 1611 was a transformation in education, not just in religion. That people now had access to read it themselves. They could do their own interpretation of it.
So you're saying that when the Christian world turned around and made the Bible more democratic, It also brought along with literacy the ability to understand other things and
I think it did.
and basically spark the Enlightenment and
I think
made
it
it more
set the
possible.
groundwork for it. And certainly, I mean, Wycliffe was put to death for translating the Bible from Latin. What was he doing? He was simply saying the people should be able to read this book
Yes.
in their own tongue. They should be able to discuss it. Up till that time,
Yeah.
it was, reading in fact, was almost prohibited.
Yes. It belonged to a small group of the elite
Yes.
who were often in the monasteries. And I think James Hannam is a historian who has written a few books about how the Dark Ages weren't really dark. And he actually points out all the major scientific advances that happened from 500 AD to 1300 AD. When Isaac Newton said that if he has seen further than any man, it's because he stood on the shoulders of giants, he was actually speaking about scientists or people who made these advances during what we call the Dark Ages.
Oh, that's right. I mean, there were things going on, but they were restricted into places like monasteries. But then,
Yes.
monasteries are the things that evolved into universities.
Exactly, yes.
So, I mean, there were various things going on, there were restrictions. But at the same time, there were Muslim groups that were
Yes.
preserving the Greek philosophy.
And making advances of their
and
own.
making advances of their own. So, but they were still restricted to a elite group, if you like, or a restricted group within certain
Yes.
organisations.
But it
in
is
certain
interesting to note, in spite of the allegation that Christianity smothered knowledge and advance, that actually religion, I think, probably was the motivator for a lot of people in those so-called Dark Ages to understand the mind of God, basically, as they studied the natural world.
Well, the religious people were the ones with the education.
That's true.
That
yes.
was providing the education. They were the people who could read.
Yeah.
They were the people who could write. So they were the ones who were always going to be making advances and doing the philosophical thinking about things.
Yes.
So I don't think there were Dark Ages in the sense that the vast majority of people mightn't
Yes.
be living the sort of life that we would like people
Yeah.
to live. But there's the suggestion that all progress in human knowledge stopped
Yes.
is nonsense, because that's never going to happen. It never has.
Yeah. And it's interesting to note that even into the modern era, significant advances have been made by people once again motivated by their Christianity. So things like even the controversial Big Bang theory apparently was devised by a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre, probably pronouncing that wrong. Isaac Newton famously was spent the last years of his life studying theology because he thought that was the really important thing. Florence Nightingale and the advances she made.
I mean, Gregor Mendel got a job as a priest
Yes.
because it gave him the time to play with his sweet peas and do stuff. It was the perfect job for him. That really, he saw that as an opportunity to be able to go and study something.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that the church has provided that kind of educational basis.
Yes.
But yes, things were happening, but they might not be visible.
Yeah.
We didn't. You might have a scientific revolution, but I think Newton was right. It didn't just suddenly come from nowhere. Now, resistance to things like the heliocentric view of the solar system.
Yes, which is usually the big illustration that's put forward, Galileo and yes.
Now, Galileo was in fact. His problem was he disagreed with his friend who was the Pope.
Yes. Never a wise thing to do.
Never a wise thing to publicly come out and say the Pope is wrong,
Yes.
particularly in those times. But that was a case where the church was simply wrong. People were taking a literal view of the Bible
Yes.
and saying this is correct. That eventually changed. The church eventually accepted it. Now, it took the Catholic Church a long time to actually forgive Galileo officially.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's been any idea that the Catholic Church has held any kind of, Earth-centric view of the solar system for the last few hundred years. The official position has been mumble, mumble, mumble. When the Pope finally came out and said, yes, Galileo was right and we did the wrong thing by him.
Yes.
There were changes in that. But then, again, that was coming from, it's hard to overturn any tradition. It's hard to overturn... it was hard to overturn some of the things that Aristotle said,
Yes. Yes.
where he got things wrong.
But I think the Christian church in general learnt a very good lesson there. I recall reading a letter by Cardinal Bellarmine, I think, who was the one who prosecuted Galileo. where he basically said, you know, this idea of the the earth going around the sun is contrary to Scripture and contrary to our traditions and will destroy, you know, the Christian faith, and therefore, you know, it must be stopped. I think there's a very good lesson for us to learn there, which is, you know, Christ basically said, I am the truth, and the search for truth should be conducted courageously. The Christian should never be afraid of what they're going to find out in science, because if God is true, then whatever we find out in the world that God created is going to fit with the true God.
It should do too. I mean, there's obviously opposition to lots of scientific advances.
Yes.
But over the last 300 years, when science was sort of invented, which was an Enlightenment thing,
Yeah.
yes, the places where God can hide, if you like, have become smaller and smaller. That things which in the past we didn't know why they happened.
Yes.
We didn't know why tides happened. Now we know. It isn't God doing something.
Yeah.
But that doesn't take away from, you know, I don't think we're worse off because we know the truth about some things.
Yeah. Many would argue we're better off.
Well, I certainly think we are.
Yes.
I mean, is it better to believe in that diseases are caused by bacteria and viruses which can be treated by antibiotics and various other things,
Yes.
and to believe that diseases are caused by evil spirits which can only be removed by exorcism?
Yeah.
Yes, we've moved beyond that. We don't do that sort of things anymore.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that, you know, I think that's one thing, as I referred to before. I think that the Christian religion allows this form of dissent and allows this ability to change things around. You know, Christianity didn't collapse because it was finally decided that, you know,
Yes.
the earth is not the centre of the universe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then, of course, we come to the 20th century, where, in fact, if you really want to be precise, the earth is the centre of the universe, but that's a different argument altogether.
Yes. Oh, we won't go into that today.
Everywhere is the centre of the universe.
Yes. Yes. Look, one last thing. The allegation that Christianity has led to so much violence and death throughout history, can we really attribute that violence and death to the Christian faith?
I think in some senses we can, because if people have an absolute belief that they're right and that everybody else is wrong, then it can always lead to violence, or it can lead to oppression, it can lead to very bad things. So I think that, yes, that bad things were done. Those things might not have been done if people hadn't been Christians.
Yeah.
But then we look at other religions and they've all done bad things. And generally to outsiders, that is, people that aren't our group.
Yeah.
All societies have a prohibition against killing. You don't need the Ten Commandments to tell you that you shouldn't kill people. But that killing has always been, that rule has always applied to your tribe or your group.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply to people outside necessarily.
Well, I suppose there are societies where they've had human sacrifice,
Yes.
for example, even in some rather fanatical countries today. You know, if your daughter is, you know, active with a boy, you have the right to kill her to preserve the honour of your family. So in a sense, maybe Christianity has brought some civilization.
I think it has. It's interesting about the human sacrifices that I've read once that one of the reasons that Cortes decided to really go savage on the Aztecs, he was invited to a dinner with some Aztec leader, and as the entertainment for the night they did a human sacrifice.
Wow.
And he said that that is not the way humans should behave.
Yes.
And decided then and there that these people were subhuman and therefore would be destroyed. So, I mean, he was probably as crazy as they were
Yes.
in his reaction to it. But he saw that as being something which was beyond the pale. You shouldn't be doing that sort of thing.
Yes.
I don't think he knew they were sacrificing 25,000 people a year or whatever. It's an incredible number.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there are always bad things you can do.
But you identify a very important point, which I think often the motivation for the violence that has happened, I would think, is not really due to what Christianity teaches, but more due to that tribe mentality of us against them, and the idea that if I'm right, they have to be wrong, and therefore they have to be forced into submission.
Yes.
But I would see that as contrary to Christian teaching. I mean, you know, Christ himself, when people didn't accept what he was saying, basically said, leave them alone, you know, let them go their way, which is not really what we see that, you know, then later generations of Christians doing. So, you know, I ask the question again, is it really due to the Christian faith as such, or is it due to Christians who hold the Christian faith not really following what it teaches, but really following their own human nature? And
I think it's the human nature thing.
yeah,
I mean, the classic example of Christian opposition to things is the blood libel on the Jews.
yeah,
That, you know, we have to destroy the Jews because the Jews killed Jesus. No, the Romans killed Jesus. And
Yes.
under Roman law at the time, he was effectively, you know, an insurgent.
yes,
That he wasn't the only person that was, you know, scourged and crucified
yes.
for resisting Roman rule. Someone said, now, after the Spartan Revolution, there were miles outside Rome with crucified people on both sides of the roads.
Yes.
That was what they did to people
Yeah.
that, you know, tried to, you know, create dissent against Roman rule.
So really we should be upset with the Italian people today.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, the fact that no, yes, the Jewish society, but then they were effectively a captive nation at the time.
Yeah.
To use that for hundreds of years later, in fact, thousands of years later,
Yeah.
as a justification behaviour against another religious group or another ethnic group, ethnic and religious group, because, you know, Jews and Judaism and Jewish ethnicity are intertwined. I think that's a really bad thing, but that's
Yes.
maybe. And when you say to people, Jesus was a Jew,
Yeah, well,
They-
he was, yes.
that tends to set them back a bit. But no, they then refer to the, you know, paintings of Jesus that are shown throughout Europe, which show him as being blue-eyed, light-skinned with blonde hair.
Yes, well,
Whereas, of course, he wasn't. He was probably, you know, swarthy-skinned, brown-eyed, black hair, and a lot shorter than he was in the pictures.
well, in our sister Ethiopian church, he's often given a very dark skin.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
And yet there was an extremely controversial painting done a few years back of an Asian Jesus. And that was seen as being some kind of blasphemy, whereas the point the artist was making was that Jesus was for everybody.
Yes, he assumed human nature.
Yes.
We're going to have to wrap it up, unfortunately, Peter, much as I've enjoyed this chat with you. So we come to the end of this discussion on was Christianity good for the world in history? Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found the discussion stimulating and interesting, and thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you.
Until next time, look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.